Hello and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time, hi, I'm Cassidy. If it's not, thanks for always tuning into my video. Today, let's talk fantasy. Let's talk getting ready to read fantasy. You want to start reading the best genre there is. I'm just kidding, there's no better genre than others. It's just my personal favorite. Okay, so, obviously fantasy can be intimidating to lots of people. You're not quite sure how to wrap your head around concepts, anything. So this is a video with tips how to read fantasy, but also recommendations for fantasy books that are good to start. Yeah, so let's start with some tips. My first tip is if you've never read fantasy before and you find the world is almost confusing, to start with either a book to adaptation book. So, something like Shadow and Bone, where there is a Netflix show out right now for the first book. It is smart, I think, if you read this and you're confused, you can also watch the show, or if you watch the show first and then you read this will help you be able to wrap your head around the world, the characters, everything going on, because you have two different formats to view it on. So, something like Shadow and Bone is good. If you're a little bit more advanced, Game of Thrones, like, Shadow and Bone is definitely more beginner, but if you're trying to work your way up to those high epic fantasies, Game of Thrones, the series, then you read the book. Also, the audiobooks to Game of Thrones are impeccable. Another tip for me is urban fantasy, something where it's still in this world, but there is a magic system. So books like Jade City, A Darker Shade of Magic, both books I haven't read, but they're urban fantasy books. There is a magic system, but the basis of the world is our typical world. Again, going into that, I think a great place to start with fantasy is actually sci-fi, because sci-fi is typically our world with fantastical elements. Specifically dystopian, I find a good way to start. So something like the Scythe series by Neil Shusterman, which is a YA dystopian, is a great beginner spot for getting into fantasy, because it's our world. And with Scythe, it is more magical than just a regular dystopian where, like, there's zombies or a pandemic or something. There is a magical element to it because these people can't die. Because, well, they can die, but health is not an issue. Like, no one dies because of health or old age or anything like that. They only die if a scythe kills them. So, I think that is a great place to start. Other dystopian recs, I mean, a zombie recommendation is technically fantasy in my head. So, zombie books, but definitely would recommend Scythe to start. Even any, I feel like, dystopian book, because it's just the beginning of complex books where, like, sometimes with the plot of, like, a romance or a literary fiction or a thriller, they're not as complex, there's not as many layering objectives, so starting with a sci-fi, a dystopian, just makes you start to understand in your brain to be able to pick up on all of these layers and make them comprehend in your brain. Does that make sense? I hope so. Another dystopian I loved was Wool, or if you just want a short one, Sand by Hugh Howey. Okay. And then, again, another amazing place to start for reading is with middle grade. Middle grade fantasy is literally meant for children. So, and they're still enjoyable as an adult. So, something like Amari and the Night Brothers, which is incredible, and I literally just finished it. There's a bookmark in here, but I finished this yesterday. And this is a book I think everybody should read. There are fantastical elements in this. We're following a girl, a child, but she is learning about the magic in the world. So it is this, because it's a middle grade book, things are put to you in very plain terms, but are still fantastical. They're still complex, but they're just written to you in plainer terms than, like, a high epic fantasy. So a wonderful place to start. There are plenty of beautiful, fantastical middle grade recs, and to be honest, I don't read that much middle grade. But if you want some, I would definitely check out J.D. Ray Reads or How to Train Your Gammon, because they both read tons of middle grade, and they're where I get all of my middle grade recommendations. So how pretty is this question mark? This is the naked hardback. I took the dust jacket off to read. Woo. From there, I would just say another tip to getting into fantasy is to read along with an audiobook. Sometimes, because there are so many different characters and they have the hardest character names. Like, we do not name our fantasy characters just like Lucy and Emily and Taylor and Jason and Jacob and Jeff. We're naming them so complex and no one knows how to pronounce them and you just get lost because there's so many random hard names that listening to an audiobook, one, if it's done well, you'll have different character voices, so you can kind of start to understand. And even if you like are unsure sometimes when you're reading who this character is, the voice clicks into your head that, oh yes, this is Kaladin, this is Nona, this is whoever, and then from there you can kind of start to understand more, and you're also processing it in two different media format. So if you're reading along while you're listening, sometimes what your eyes don't catch, your ears will catch, and your brain will just understand better, in my opinion, on technical terms. But there we go. Audiobooks are like one of my favorite ways to listen to read. Audiobooks are one of my favorite ways to read a book, especially fantasy books, because I think they're done so well. Like when a fantasy book is done well in audio format, it is like watching a film. Like it's a beautiful thing. So I definitely sometimes will read along, even though I don't need it for like the help that it has. I just love to do it, and yeah. And then if you just want to listen to audiobooks that are fantasy, another like slight tip is sometimes I will do that for the beginning part until like the first 100 pages of a book. I'll listen to the audiobook format and read along, and then eventually I'll be able to stop doing one or the other because I've gotten a better grasp on the world, the characters, the magic system, so I can either just read it without the audiobook or listen to the audiobook without the book for the rest of the 700 pages it is. Another tip, just start slow. Do not feel like you have to dive deep into these high epic fantasies right away. YA is a beautiful genre and there are plenty of amazing YA books. And it's like a nice start off to go from YA to maybe a little bit more new adult to adult, and I still read all of these. As I said, middle grade's a great place to start. Start at middle grade, YA, little basic adult, and then like high fantasy. So I guess I should recommend you some books. As I said, Amari and the Night Brothers for middle grade. That's great, I think. I haven't read it, but A Pinch of Magic I've heard is great. Frostheart I've heard is great. All wonderful places to start. Oh, Nevermore I heard is great. If you're gonna go into YA, some amazing YA series. Spellslinger by Sebastian de Castell. I've only read the first book, and everyone seems to love it. There's some humor in here. This is very easy to read. It's very accessible, I feel like, as a fantasy book. There's not too much happening here. As I said, Shadow and Bone. Personally, I liked Six Crows way more than Shadow and Bone, so I honestly recommend to skip Shadow and Bone because I don't think it's necessary to read. Oops, I might get some hate from that. I read Six Crows first, and I didn't feel confused at all. Actually, I think reading Shadow and Bone, I was more confused about how Six Crows went. So, I told my sister to not read these. But obviously, if you're wanting the adaptation, you need to read this one to be able to watch along, because Six of Crows has nothing to do with what the adaptation is doing currently. But Six of Crows, Lee Bardugo is very accessible as a fantasy reader. Those are a couple YAs. I'm trying to think of other ones I have. Red Rising is a YA that I personally picked up thinking it was an adult book, and I think it does read a little bit new adult, so I would put Red Rising as a good one, which is a sci-fi fantasy, so again, a good place to start. I think very accessible to everyone is A Winter's Promise. This is shelved in my local bookstores and chapters as a YA, but again, I think that it could be shelved as adult. It's got some adult themes going on. A Winter's Promise is a beautiful book. I love it. It's one of my favorites, although I haven't read the last book yet. And I've heard some bad mixed reviews about the last book, but I think that this has a pretty basic magic system to grasp, as it's more of a character-driven with a plot. It's still got a great plot, but it's definitely, you have to like the characters in order to enjoy this book. I, again, think the audiobook of this is amazing. So, a good read along. And then from there, I'm going to move on to more of adult, but these are kind of what I would probably put as a lower adult, so like a new adult, still comprehensible. When I read The Poppy War, I thought this was very accessible in terms of writing style. It's not too complex of a world, we do have some confusion because I feel like Rin is a little bit of a confusing character to read from, because there is a lot, but besides the dark triggers in this book, like, please look up trigger warnings for this book before you read. I think that it is a very good book to get you started in the genre, specifically in the grimdark genre. And it's my favorite, and I listened to the audiobook. I actually only own the physical copy of this one because the rest are all in audiobook, and when I have enough money, I will buy the beautiful hardbacks of the other two, but for now, I just survive with the Poppy War because I listened to them all in audiobook. Oh, I missed An Ember in the Ashes series. Could be a good YA to start too. It's got more of a romance plot, so it's a military fantasy with a heavy romance going on, so for YA it's definitely more accessible, and I still loved it for, like, the military aspect. If you're wanting to get into that military fantasy genre, An Ember in the Ashes. Another one that I think is great to start at is City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. This definitely is a political fantasy and can get confusing at times, but here's the thing. Fantasy books are confusing. I think this is something that I enjoy, is I don't mind being confused as long as it wraps up in the end. So with fantasy books, I like to remind people that if you're a little bit confused, it's fine, and all will make sense in the end. So with a book like this, it's definitely a little confusing because there's lots of politics. It's politics heavy, and you're following two different characters. But the writing of this is really easy to follow. The world building is super easy to follow. I definitely think this one is accessible. I would put it a good one to read if you're starting out and just want some help. Mistborn, Brandon Sanderson. Always a great place to start. Mistborn is placed as an adult or YA book. He purposely put it both ways because it is one of those books that just goes either way. It is a high fantasy with it's a high fantasy with politics, but it's so accessible, like, very, very easy to start with. And then other than that, we just have high fantasy, which there's not really any beginner-friendly high fantasies. I would maybe put Robin Hobb in this list because it's very intimidating. She's very intimidating because her series Realm of the Elderlings is so long, but since every series is split into, like, there's trilogies that make up the whole world that follow different characters and different plot lines, is more accessible than, let's say, Wheel of Time or Brandon Sanderson, that just stretch out 12 books long and they all follow the same plot line. And Assassin's Apprentice is quite short. So if you're looking at starting high epic fantasies that are very long and stretched out, Realm of the Elderlings is 100% a great place to start, because I'll read a trilogy and then stop and then read another trilogy, and it feels easier to tackle because you're like, I have a trilogy to read. I have 3 books to read instead of this is 1 in 12. I just think of it as the individual sections. Her writing is definitely not as accessible. It's complicated. It takes you a while to read. Chapters are long, but it's a good payoff. So definitely, if you were just wanting to get into those high fantasy worlds, this is a great place to start. My last tip, I think, is to buddy read. If you are wanting to get into fantasy and you're worried about being confused, well, I guess I have a couple more, actually, tips. If you're worried about being confused, just buddy reading and being able to talk to each other about what's going on, because if you're confused, your friend might not be confused, or with, like, a group or something like that, that will help you be unconfused. Or even just talking to someone who's read the book. You're always welcome to slide into my DMs. Like, I have my one friend starting to read fantasy, and sometimes she messages me and she's just like, I'm confused. I know you read this book. This is what I'm confused about. And either I'll be like, man, you're meant to be confused because you'll find it out later. Or it's like, this is what's happening. Another tip is fan art. It's hard because fan art can spoil things. You do have to be aware. But I had a friend who read ACOTAR, and she was a little confused about the fairies. It was like, she's brand new to fantasy, and she was like, what are they, does this just make them humans with, like, magical powers? Like, what is this? So I sent her fan art of, like, the Bat Boys, and that helped her be able to picture things more in her head, and that helped her understand definitely, if you have a friend who has read the book, ask them to look up the fan art, because sometimes fan art can be spoily, but they are. I also looked up fan art in the live ship traders, because I was like, what do these boats look like? And I was very confused trying to picture Paragon swinging his arms, but he's a boat. So, fan art can be your friend, just careful because of spoilers. That's pretty much it. I think the best way to get into fantasy is just dive right into it, and I hope you love it as much as I do. I pretty much talk about fantasy all the time on this channel, but I do read other genres. Well, there you are. We've come to the end of my tips to getting into fantasy and fantasy recommendations for beginners. This is kind of a different video for my channel, so let me know if you liked it. Whew, if you made it this far and you just want to leave me a comment to say you were here but you have nothing to say, you can just leave me an emoji. Let's leave me the chili pepper emoji, like the hot chili, like it's spicy. Leave me that in the comments. Otherwise, feel free to talk to me about other books that you think are beginner friendly. If you have other tips for people starting out in fantasy, if you liked these tips, and much more, anything you want to talk to me about, really. Have a wonderful day, guys. If you'd like to connect with me on other platforms, my Bookstagram, my Book Twitter, my Goodreads, and my beauty channel are all linked in the description bar below. Have a wonderful day. I'm going to leave some videos on the screen that I think you would enjoy if you checked out.